Hello, in this video we are going to add the end zone to our level. When the player reaches the end zone, the player is going to stop moving and velocity will go to 0 and the player's reset function will get triggered, which will reload the scene. So in order for this to happen, we have to go into the player's script and add a public function, and we'll call it stop. So it has to be public because it's going to be called by somebody else. And so let's open up the player's script here. Let's add a public function called stop. It doesn't need to return anything, so it'll return void. We'll call it stop. And what's it going to do? Well, how do we stop the player from moving? Well, we've got this variable that we added way up here called alive, and we said only let the player move left and right if we're alive. So I think we want to set alive to false for sure, and that will stop the player from moving. And so let's set alive to false. And then, now the problem is the cube is already moving, and we need to stop it from moving. We need to set its velocity to 0. So how do we set its velocity to 0? Well, remember that rigid body component that we added to it is storing all of the physics information about, its mass, friction, wherever it's going. We need to go into that object, and that object is storing the velocity, and we can set the velocity to 0. And not just 1 0, 3 zeros, because remember, we have an X, Y, and Z axis now. We're in 3 dimensions. So we need to set all 3 axes to 0. So we can start by just getting the rigid body component off of this object, and then we can go into that object and see what it's got in it. There's a get component function. So if you want to get a component off an object, you say get component. And then in the angle brackets, you specify the type of component you want to get. So we want to get the rigid body component. And then let's go into that, and you'll see that if I type V, you'll see, oh, that has a velocity in it. So the rigid body is how this thing behaves in the physics system, and it has a velocity on it. And the velocity is actually it's not one velocity. If I hover over this, you'll see it's a vector 3. So a vector 3 it's a vector with 3 parts, an x and a y and a z. So we want to set all of those to 0. So I could say set it to a new vector 3 and then initialize the vector 3 to 0, 0, 0. That would work fine. A slightly shorter way of doing that is vector 3 already has something in it called 0. That is, since that vector is used so much, if I hover over this, it's going to say, okay, there's a vector 3 called 0, 0, 0, shorthand for writing vector 0, 0, 0, right? Okay, so that's a shorthand way of doing it. And once the player has stopped, we probably want to reset the game. But we don't want to reset the game right away. We want to have a short delay before we reset the game. And we can just copy and paste this line up here. We can use our invoke function. So invoke is like an alarm in GameMaker. We say we're going to call our reset function in 5 seconds. And so that way, when somebody else calls the stop function, the player will become unresponsive, the player will stop moving, and 5 seconds later, the level will reset. So now all we need to do is add an object into the world and say when the player hits that object or enters the box around that object, call the player's stop function. All right, so let's go add our physical end zone here. I'm going to save my script, and let me add an end zone. So in my project here, what am I going to do? Let me go add a new game object. I'm going to add a new 3D object here called cube, and I'm going to call it end zone. There we go. And see, it's still floating in space there. So let's set its y coordinate to 0.5. That'll put it down on the ground. And let's change its x scale to be 8. And now it'll be exactly as wide as the level. Let's set its x coordinate to 0. That should put it in the middle of the level. And then we could scale it up or up or down the z-axis. To make it a little bit bigger, I could click the scale tool, pull, like something like that. Doesn't really matter because the player isn't going to be airborne. That's perfectly fine. I don't know if you want to go in here and scale the thing up and you know, that's fine too. Set this, got this, yeah, that's huge. All right, it's kind of overkill. There we go. I set it to the y to 4 and the y scale to 4 and the y position to 2, and that puts the thing right on the board. Okay, so now let's move this thing all the way down to the very end of the board. So I don't know, how long did we say the thing was? Was it 500 things long? Let me go into the z coordinate on this thing and I'll set it to 5. Nope, that's the scale. I don't want to do that. Oh, that was bad. Let's go into the z coordinate there. I'm going to move the whole thing down to 500 and double click on it, and you can see, wow, cool, that was neat. It just snapped right to the end. So let's just leave it right there. And this thing's got a box collider on it, but we don't want it to be a solid object. We want it to be kind of an alarm zone. So that's what a trigger box is for. So if I check that, this thing is no longer solid. Now it acts as an alarm zone. So anytime something enters the box around this thing, it's going to get an alarm message. And let's also, since we don't want this thing to be visible, let's uncheck the mesh renderer. And you can see now, like, what we have is just this invisible box that we're going to put a script on, and that script is going to listen for collisions. So now let's go write the script that we're going to put on this box. So let's go to our scripts folder here and create yet another script. And I'm going to call it win. You can call it Endzone, it doesn't really matter. And let's open that up. And what we're going to do in this script is listen for collisions with the player. Or we're going to listen for anything entering the trigger box around this object. So the function for that is on TriggerEnter. This is just like an event handling function in Visual Studio when we were doing C#. So anytime something enters the trigger box around this object, we will be notified of it. And the parameter that you get that contains information about the thing that entered the collider, the trigger box, is it's a collider. So you are supplied with the collider object on the thing that entered the box. So if we go back to the player here, you should see that our player has a box collider. So when the player enters that invisible box, that collider is passed in as the parameter to that function. So in GameMaker, remember we had the concept of other. When you have a collision with two objects, there's you and there's the other guy. The collider is kind of the other guy. It's information about that thing's collider. Now, what we want to do, though, is check the tag on that thing to make sure it's the player, and then also get the object off of that collider, and then call the stop function on that object's player script. Great. So what we need to do is get that object that hit us, and then get a reference to the script that's got the stop function, and then call the stop function. So first, let's check to see what the tag on that thing was. So every component happens to know what game object it's attached to. Every component stores the variable the game object it's attached to in a variable called, not surprisingly, game object. So this is the collider's game objects, and then we can use the dot operator again and check the tag on the collider. So this is the collider's game objects tag, and we'll make sure that that's player. Remember, we tagged our cube player. So if this thing is the player and not an obstacle that we misplaced or the floor or something like that, well, now what do we want to do? We want to get a reference to that script that's on the player, the one that's got the stop function, and then call the stop function. So so the word player here is the script, right? We made a script called player. There's our player script, and it is a component. So now I can use that as if it were a variable. A player is a type of thing. So let's get a reference to that script, and we'll call it P. And how do we actually get that that object? I guess you could call this thing, what did I guess in the document I called this thing other, and here I called it C. sees game objects. So get the game object and then get the call its get component function. So now that I've got the game object, which is the thing that hit me, I can say get its player component. Now if that thing weren't a player, the player and it didn't have that component, it would return null, and then that would be bad. And then all I need to do is now call the stop function. Right, so what I'm doing is go get the player script component off of the player, call the stop function in that script. And then the last thing I need to do is just take that script and put it on the end zone here. And I can just take that and drag it down here, or I could drag it onto that object. And now it's got that script. So anytime something enters the trigger box, the collider on the thing that went into the box is going to be passed in as the parameter to this function. We're going to check the tag on whatever game object was associated with that thing that hit us. And if it's a player, then we're going to get the player script off of it and call the stop function in that script. So let's run this now. I shouldn't have to actually put the player run the player all the way down the board. Just for cheating, I can come in here and set the player's Z coordinate to be like 450 or something, and let's run it and see if it works. So now the player's moving and nothing happened. All right, hang on. I think this may be as dumb as I just didn't save my script. So I'm going to go up here and do file save, and let's just try it again. Just for the sake of debugging here, I'm going to put in a log message, debug.log something hit the end zone. So it'll write that to the console when something hits the end zone. And actually what would be more useful is to print out the tag that was on that thing. We could say its tag was and then let's get the collider's game objects tag, and we'll just print that out too. So we'll just dump stuff out to the console, save that, run it, and something hit the end zone. It was the player, and it should call the player stop function, and you can see that it reset. And now we're just going to sit here in an endless loop because in our scene the player is just right in front of the finish line. So there you go. That's really all you need to get this thing to kind of to loop endlessly. Now I can go and I can put the player back at 2 or 3 or wherever the player started and test it out. There we go. Whee! And now I can have a nice long run down here. So what you can do is make more, make more types of obstacles, kind of interesting patterns. Make the board longer. You could also change the reset function. You could have multiple scenes, and you could have, in the stop function, rather than reloading the current level, in the player's functions here. You see here where we're in the reset function. Rather than loading the same scene, you could load a different scene. You could find a way to do that, and then you could have a series of levels that you had to progress through. So there you go. Hopefully that wasn't too bad. I know this code is very baffling because not only is it C#, it's Unity's extensions on C#, and there's a lot of template notation in here like the angle brackets, and it's it is really elegant and very nice, but it's also a lot of information to try to take in at once. So hopefully that kind of clarifies, well, some stuff. Hopefully it gets your project working. If you have any questions on how to get that to work, just ask. But at this point, you should have a playable game. Just have fun designing interesting levels and enjoy what you're working on.